Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be continuing our series of looking at potential Russian bias in the game of War Thunder by examining the various shell types in the game and seeing how they may or may not provide an unfair advantage to specific nations. Now, to clarify a point a few people seemed confused on by the last video, I'm not actually saying there definitely is a bias. The point of this series is to look at areas where you could see one nation as having an inherent advantage and to break down aspects of it to see if there is a consistent pattern or if it's just hot air. And to kick this off, we'll look at the shells that predominantly exist in the World War II/early Cold War era, starting with armor-piercing high explosive or APHE, specifically APHE with a ballistic cap, as these tend to be the best shells in the game. They have a great combination of penetration, they have really good angled performance, and they do a ton of damage. Solid shot and early APDS or armor-piercing discarded sabot rounds are kind of in the middle of this group, as depending on the specific vehicle and gun, some of them are pretty usable and some of them very much are not. The biggest drawback to both of these shells is their damage tends to be fairly weak and fairly inconsistent. And then of course we get to easily the worst shell type in the game, APCR or armor-piercing composite rigid. While it does generally have high penetration, the damage on it is outright abysmal. Interestingly enough, if you were to map the usage of these shells by Soviet forces, this is basically a gradient of the shells they use, with APHE being the most common. In fact, many Soviet tanks have 2 to 3 different versions of APHE of varying degrees of quality. It's also very noteworthy that APHE shells within War Thunder have a rather eccentric behavior pattern. That is to say, when they explode in a sphere, which doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. In order for that to happen, the shell would essentially have to stop mid-air and lose all of its momentum before exploding, because obviously the shell fragmentation is keeping its forward momentum, so you would still theoretically get a cone. In practice and in testing by the US military, APHE, AP, and APCR all had very similar spall patterns, to the point where it wasn't really that important which one you fired. The Russian shells in particular also tend to have some fairly unreasonable angled performance, able to bite in even fairly shallow angles on thinner plates, and often find penetrating hits where a normal round would ricochet. All that being said, when Gaijin did propose fixing the damage on APHE rounds, I was personally against it, and a big part of the reason is the World War II battle ratings tend to rely heavily on the spherical damage from APHE to balance some of the tanks that have very small or very inconsistent weak spots. Something like an IS-1 or IS-2 is actually relatively vulnerable just because of their cupola, and of course that would be removed if APHE was nerfed into more of a cone type spread. Additionally, a lot of newer players start the game at these battle ratings, and APHE is a lot more new player friendly, as you simply have to get the round anywhere into the fighting compartment to take out the entire crew. So I do think there is a compelling reason for APHE to be in its current state, even if it is somewhat unrealistic and ahistorical. Additionally, I somewhat suspect that the performance against angles of Russian shells is due to their higher calibers and the tendency of shells to overmatch. That is to say, if the shell has a wider diameter than the armor has thickness, the shell tends to care about angles significantly less. While overmatch is not a specifically stated mechanic in War Thunder, it is actually a thing in real armor penetration and could be part of the reason why these shells perform so well against angles, especially the very high caliber shells like the 152 and 122. There is a rather significant curiosity when you go from APHE to normal solid shot armor piercing shells, in that an armor piercing high explosive shell has to have a cavity for an explosive filler and a fuse, whereas a solid shot armor piercing shell doesn't. So in theory, all other factors being equal, the solid shot armor piercing shell should have more penetration. However, in War Thunder, the vast majority of tanks that have access to both of these shells, the solid shot actually performs worse. With that being said, obviously there are a lot of factors that go into shell performance, so unless the two shells are identical outside of that one factor, you could still expect to see a difference. But I do suspect this actually has more to do with gameplay, as many tanks are forced to start with solid shot, and as we're going to discuss later when we get to Heat FS, a free-to-play game does have a core principle of annoying the player and to try and get them to spend money, and I strongly suspect that's part of the reason why a lot of these stock armor-piercing shells are so bad. Currently, I'm getting to the end of the French tech tree, and it turns out a lot of French vehicles are stuck with solid shot, and their solid shot on the whole performs significantly better than something like, say, the stock American 75 and 76 solid shot. Of course, when you get to Sabot and APCR, the two biggest issues are that the shells tend to shatter, and also they tend to have fairly low and fairly inconsistent damage. My current suspicion on this is that it is less to specifically buff or nerf certain vehicles, and more that the developers probably thought it would be difficult to balance the game if a regular 75 Sherman firing APCR could comfortably comfortably take down a Tiger. A lot of tanks firing APCR and Sabos fight some of the later World War II heavies, and most of the later World War II heavies are not particularly good against these types of shells in terms of raw armor performance, so this might be more to keep the game from getting really wonky balance-wise in terms of the positioning of heavy tanks, rather than a specific buff or nerf to any one nation, but that's just my suspicion on the matter. That being said, it is incredibly weird that APCR is traditionally very useless and also the last shell you unlock, so a lot of players might confuse it for being the best when in reality it has the fewest applications on the vast majority of vehicles. On the whole, the emphasis on APHE shells that can punch through relatively thin plates even at steep angles does tend to favor Soviet tanks more often than most others, as Soviet tanks tend to be heavily armored all around much more than having their armor focused on one side like a tank like the Jumbo does. That being said, Tigers and King Tigers also enjoy some pretty good all-around protection and have very high quality APHE shells with ballistic caps that can bite into angles as well, and of course the Soviet tanks with their cupolas do tend to be vulnerable to just getting one-shotted through that, especially as they have very cramped crew compartments, so while it can benefit the Soviets in some areas, it also hurts them in others. I would say the lack of APCR in the meta does help the Soviets more than most, as APCR would negate a lot of their armor, but on the whole Soviet armor is more about goofy angles rather than raw thickness anyway. One interesting aspect of the ammunition discussion that doesn't get brought up enough is actually the high explosive shells. High explosive shells are very subjective in terms of how you implement them in game, because obviously real world high explosive shells don't really have an armor penetration value. They're mostly working on concussion, which the game doesn't really represent adequately. As I said in my Abrams video, whenever something can be interpreted with multiple ways, you tend to see some of the bias leak through, and at least part of that is present on Russian top tier vehicles and their particularly effective 125 high explosive rounds, which tend to mostly outclass any NATO high explosive rounds except for the exceedingly goofy Israeli Merkava 120 timed high explosive that functions in a way that it probably shouldn't. While the Russian tanks do generally use higher calibers, which result in more explosive filler, the difference, especially when you're talking something like a 120 to a 125, is not really going to be enough to go from not hurting a tank at all to absolutely obliterating it, but this is certainly an area where there's no such thing as empirical evidence as to what a shell does or does not do, as in general the way high explosive shells work doesn't exactly work well with the way the War Thunder engine is designed. Moving on to top tier, and we have the dart shell, and I have an entire video discussing the numerous problems with the way darts are currently implemented and work at top tier that result in them being at best a bit of a lottery, so I will let viewers who are interested check out that video, but long story short, the more Gaijin model things on vehicles, the more inconsistent darts tend to get, at least at this point in the game. Of course, the developers have modeled Russian vehicles in a way that is somewhat generous, but that's a discussion for another video that we'll have later. Of course, a shell that everybody will know and probably loathe if they've had to spade a top tier tank is the Heat FS round that comes stock on a lot of top tier vehicles. Most of these Heat FS rounds have around 400mm of chemical penetration, which to be honest is pretty useless, especially against Russian tanks that are practically layered in ERA, both the front of the hull, the front of the turret, and often the sides and even back to an extent. And of course, even if you hit a Russian tank in the engine, what's probably going to happen is the engine's going to eat all the shrapnel from your Heat FS round, so what you're stuck with is a scenario where if you're stuck with maining Heat FS, you're basically aiming for the driver's port, maybe the lower front plate, but even then the lower front plate is often not a disabling hit. Maybe you go for the barrel. There are very few places you can realistically shoot a Russian tank with a Heat FS shell and expect to kill it, and of course having to grind this stock, which can take a lot of research points to get your first dart, is a bit of a pain and heavily benefits Russian vehicles. All that being said, I have very recently been stock grinding some of the French tanks, and I can say with absolute certainty that a lot of the more recent Leopards that have been added to the game are not significantly better. There are very few places to shoot a Stritzfong 122B Plus or a Leopard 2A7V that will reliably do any kind of meaningful damage to them, or at least any more so than a T90M or T80 BVM. Anecdotally, I found the tank that was the easiest to fight with stock heat both then and now is actually the Abrams, because it has a fairly large prominent weak point basically in the middle of the tank that you will often hit by accident and that virtually disables or kills it every time. Much like with the fairly craptastic performance of the regular armor-piercing shells at lower tiers, I strongly suspect the heat shells being stock is more about Gaijin trying to annoy you into making money than specifically benefit Russian vehicles, although it does very much incidentally benefit the vehicles that are borderline immune to heat rounds. The good news, however, is that the absolute top tier vehicles have increasingly started getting at least a weak Dart stock, so the Heat FS grind is a lot easier now than it used to be. Much like how the implementation of ERA as it currently stands does benefit Russian vehicles, the implementation of shells and what shells are best at a given battle rating also seems to heavily benefit Russian vehicles, although much like with the ERA, it's hard to definitively point out a real bias that can't simply be explained away at least to some extent. I do feel like an overall rebalancing of shells is probably in order, especially as Solid Shot AP and APCR has almost laughably bad performance in many instances, which of course negatively influences shell variety, because why would you take a shell that can't do damage even if it can punch through the opponent's armor? It doesn't do you any good to simply poke holes in the enemy if their gunner is just going to shoot you in the face. As I said at the beginning of this video, this is more of an exploration of things that may potentially disproportionately benefit one faction rather than a decisive conclusion, or at least I will save the conclusions until the end of this series. But of course, I always want to hear from you guys. What do you think? Do you think this shell balance and disproportionately favors the Soviets, or do you think it's currently fine as is? Feel free to let me know. Hope you liked the video, hope you enjoyed it. If you did, a like and subscribe always helps out the channel. As always, don't commit to shoes.